Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, a boycott of this summer's World Cup in Russia is among the options being proposed as a way for the UK to respond if Moscow is found to have used a nerve agent in an attempted assassination of the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal. That might just involve forbidding officials and politicians from attending, but pulling out the team from the tournament is also an option, with suggestions that London might also ask other countries to join this boycott. Let's speak to the former chief executive of the FA, David Davis. Mr. Davis, welcome to you. If Russia, if this deadline comes and goes and Theresa May stands up tomorrow and says, we fully believe it was the Russian state that enacted this, should we boycott the World Cup?
I'm against boycotts by England alone, except, though, of course, if there was action internationally by other countries in support of that boycott. And yes, that means that Germany, the holders, Spain, France, Poland, other countries too, if they were part of a boycott, that would make a difference. At the moment, my concern is that were England to come out on its own, the only country, the only people who would be affected by that and upset by it would be England and the English.
So what do you think would be the way forward if this is indeed what happens? The FA start having discussions behind closed doors with other FAs, probably European FAs. Do you think those discussions may already be taking place?
My own view is at the moment the discussions are primarily about the safety of, yes, the team, but also the supporters, some 15,000 at the last count, UK citizens who are likely to travel to Russia. Safety is number one. The good news is that my suspicion is that those in the Kremlin, including Mr. Putin, will want to stage a successful World Cup. And a successful World Cup has to be a safe World Cup. So that's what he'll want.
Do you think England fans at this point in time will feel safe going there?
Well, my own view is the best answer to that question I can give is that I'm hoping if I can get some tickets that I will go. And yes, I will listen to Foreign and Commonwealth Office advice right up to the last minute. But at the moment, I would be optimistic about that.
What could FIFA do here, if anything? Obviously, it's complex. I suppose there'd be more possibility of them maybe banning Russia from taking place if it wasn't taking place in Russia. But surely FIFA could do something if it turns out that the Russian state are accused of this.
It's very easy to say FIFA should do something, the FA should do something. I always point out to people the FA is not a police force, the FA is not a security advice bureau, and to my knowledge, FIFA is none of those things either.
But they have the power. They have the power to make something, to do something visible.
Of course, you can do something, and you can call off the World Cup. That's one thing you can do. Now, do I think that's likely to happen at the moment? No, I don't. Do I think the British government at the moment is intending to put pressure on the FA to pull the England team out? No, I don't. Some of us have some memory of the 1980 Olympic Games when Russia, there were boycotts of the Russian Olympic Games by certain countries and certain sports. Now, was that effective? Yes, it did affect the Olympic Games because it was an international boycott by a number of countries and a number of sports. OK,
David Davis, thank you so much for your time. We'll have to leave it there.
Now, the attack on Sergei Skripal has further strained UK-Russia relations and has put pressure on Theresa May's governments to take action. Some are suggesting that England should boycott this summer's World Cup in Russia. But is that the right course of action? Well, let's talk to Tim Farron, former leader of the Lib Dems. Very good afternoon to you, Mr Farron. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So should England boycott the World Cup?
I fear that we should, and I say that as an absolute football obsessive. I have figurine Panini albums going all the way back to 1978. which, interesting, was, of course, a year we did not qualify. And so I don't say this lightly, I say it with a very, very heavy heart. We need to remember that whilst politics and sport very often shouldn't mix and don't need to mix, Putin will make sure that it does this particular summer. What does Vladimir Putin value more than anything else? It's his prestige, his pride. If the United Kingdom, in this case England, the only home team to qualify, turn up at the Russian World Cup, my fear is that we will be seen to have basically rolled over and said, well, we may be angry with you with this appalling attack on not just two innocent individuals, but our very sovereignty as a country, that we are prepared to just roll over and allow you to have your moment in the sun. I would prefer FIFA to withdraw the World Cup from Russia, and I would also prefer then there to be some alternative competition this summer. But it's not the case. I really fear, with a very heavy heart, that England should not appear.
There are 32 teams at the World Cup in Russia this year. Will it hurt the Russians if England don't turn up?
I think the other way of looking at it is what will happen if we do. If we do, it looks like we've somehow approved of what has just happened, or at least are not that angry with. Now, there may be other permutations. We've talked about, you know, royals not going, other officials not going, and maybe that will be good enough. But my fear is you have a Russian administration that is fairly impervious to economic sanctions, financial sanctions, but absolutely values its prestige, its dignity and its pride above all else. Now, what I would say is, first of all, I'd want FIFA to withdraw the World Cup from Russia. I think that is deserved. Secondly, I think you would say if that isn't possible, or if FIFA won't do that, and they're not exactly, you know, top of the list of ethical decision makers, so I'm not entirely holding my breath on that one. But nevertheless, let's say they don't do that, then I would say our EU and our NATO allies ought to join us in this boycott. If they don't, then it's down to just us. And much as I hate to say it, my sense is that us not being there almost begins to feel inevitable now. We can't sanction what Putin himself is behind.
But my point is, if there are 32 teams at the World Cup, England pull out, the Russians will just shrug their shoulders and say, well, fair play, off you go, see you later. The other countries are in.
And that might be so. I think as I say, the way to look at it is what happens if we do go. And what looks like being the case if we do go is that we've just rolled over, that we don't think that it's an attack on our sovereignty and indeed on peace on our streets is that important. So I hate to say it, you know, I'm not just some politician who talks about football when it's, you know, politically interesting. I'm an absolute obsessive. It breaks my heart to even contemplate us not being there this summer. But my fear is if we go, it looks like we've basically just given up, rolled over and allowed Putin to have his way.
David Davis, former executive director of the FA, has said a unilateral approach won't work. What he would like to see is other European countries, for example, taking part and following the United Kingdom's lead. But if they don't, then what effect is that going to have?
Well, what effect will it have? It'll be damaging to the English game. It'll be damaging to, obviously, all the supporters like me who deeply miss England participating. It will make a significant but not disastrous impact upon Russia's hosting of the World Cup. I think we have a bigger impact culturally on the World Cup than we do as players. I don't imagine that we'll be able to do a Jesse Owens, you know, go to the international tournament and then prove everybody wrong by actually winning it. I don't think we're at that stage. If we were, maybe I'd think differently. I don't know. But what I do think is if we do go, it looks as though we have somehow approved or are not that bothered about what Putin has done. But I think David Davis is right. What we should be doing now is trying to focus on getting our EU and NATO allies together and saying, look, this is just not acceptable. We know that a lot of these decisions taken about where FIFA have put the World Cup in, not just this year in Russia, but in 2022 as well in Qatar, that those decisions were suspect, to say the least, in the first place. I think it's probably about time that, you know, the EU and NATO countries stood together and thought, well, this is the year we need to have an alternative contest if FIFA won't act in a moral and ethical way.
OK, Tim Farron, thanks for your time.
Well, Sky News has tracked down one of the scientists who actually created Novichok under a cloak of secrecy in the former Soviet Union. He's called Dr. Vil Mazyanov, and he was a director of Russia's Chemical Weapons Institute in the 1980s, and now devotes his life to ridding the world of this substance that he created. Well, he spoke to our US correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter from his home in Princeton, New Jersey, and warned that Novichok was designed to inflict catastrophic and incurable injuries.
This house on the outskirts of Princeton in New Jersey is home to a man who used to be one of Russia's top chemical weapons scientists.
Hello?
Dr. Vil Mazyanov ran the Technical Counterintelligence Department in Russia's Chemical Weapons Institute. He helped make Novichok, the class of nerve agents the British government says was used to poison a defective Russian spy in Salisbury. We're invited in. The scientist was so appalled by what he helped create, he blew the whistle and fled to America more than 20 years ago. He tells us about the damage Novichok can cause, even in the smallest doses.
No, it's the same sure nerve gas, but 10 times, at least 10 times more powerful.
Is there a cure?
No cure. No. No.
So once you're exposed, that's it?
That's it. No cure.
No antidotes?
Antidotes, yes, antidotes are. But antidote, what does mean antidote? You saving person who exposed to this gas, no, temporarily.
It's temporary?
Temporarily, yeah. Not to die in this time, but he'll be invalid for all life after that.
When you say that, what do you mean?
No, without help other people he cannot live.
Simple as that?
Yeah, it's very, very nasty stuff.
What about the general public in the UK who may have come into contact with trace amounts of Novichok?
I suppose it's very bad, because even the very small doses, very small, still they are very effective, and then consequences could be in years probably.
Consequences in years?
Absolutely.
He describes the symptoms people may experience.
Headaches, difficult thinking, and then others sometimes in this also is coordination, a lot of problems.
And those effects will last for a lifetime?
Yes.
So washing clothes, sealing belongings, cleaning down surfaces?
No, sure, it's useful. It's useful.
Not enough?
Yeah, not enough, absolutely not. Maybe from time when I left Russia, medicine, medical science maybe advanced a little bit. I'm very doubtful about that.
And so hundreds of people in the UK could now be in danger?
Yes, I am in danger.
Do you feel guilty that you made Novichok and now it's been used?
Yes, yes, I'm guilty. I participated in this criminal enterprise. Because of that, I'm probably most fiery enemy of these chemical weapons. It's a weapon of mass killing, mass murder.
The Russian government has denied involvement in the Salisbury poisoning, but Mazyanov says no one else could have done it. Novichok, he said, is like a fingerprint, and now it's at the centre of a full-blown international incident. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News in Princeton, New Jersey.
Well, despite those concerning warnings about the nerve agent Novichok from one of the chemical scientists involved in its production, Public Health England says the risk to the public in Salisbury is low. For more on that, let's cross to central London and speak to Sky's health correspondent, Paul Kelso. Pretty bleak assessment from one of the men who created it. There is no cure. There isn't really an antidote. But the Public Health England is still stressing that people in this part of the world shouldn't be overly concerned.
Yes, and there is a contrast
that has been felt on the ground in Salisbury, clearly between these messages of reassurance from Public Health England that there is a low risk to public health and the sight of people in chemical suits sealing off areas, and indeed perhaps in the way the advice from Public Health England, which has been consistent about the level of risk, but perhaps the way it has evolved. We've put the charges as put there by the former Russian chemical scientist that there is a long-term risk even from a low trace of this nerve agent. We'll put that to Public Health England today, and they continue to say there's a low risk. Let's tell you exactly what they've said in full. The Deputy Medical Director there has told us this morning, Public Health England has been working very closely with the police and national experts on chemical weapons since the start of the incident, and our risk assessment is based on knowledge of the chemical used. Our advice remains that the risk to the general public is low. I think the key phrase in there is knowledge of the chemical used. My understanding is that Public Health England has been, their experts have been working very closely with both the police and those who've been examining the substance from the start. In fact, Public Health England has a laboratory at Porton Down on the same site as the military laboratory where this substance was first analysed, and their view from the start has been that in very low doses, low traces, which was the case, was their view of the picture in Salisbury, there was not a wider danger to the public. That message changed slightly last Sunday when it became clear there were traces in the restaurant and pub that the couple had visited, and they advised anyone who'd been in either of those locations to wash their clothes, wipe their spectacles, their watch straps, phones and that sort of thing, because they acknowledged there is a risk if there is a trace element of repeated contact with the skin, and that diluting it in water, bluntly washing it, would deal with it. And they insist that is still the case. The interesting point there from Professor Murzianov is that he maintains there is a long-term health risk even from small trace elements, and that's perhaps something that we've not entirely had clarity from in Public Health England. And also the question that's been asked is why wait a week? When you know a deadly nerve agent is involved, why wait a week before giving that advice to people who may have come into contact with it, even in the smallest doses? But perhaps the best, it's a rather grim fact, but perhaps the best evidence that thus far the advice from Public Health England can be considered appropriate is that if anyone else had received any kind of significant dose, we would know about it because they would be in hospital.
Indeed, Paul, thanks very much. Well, the situation is causing a crisis of relations between the UK and Russia. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has insisted Moscow has no connection to the attack and said it will not respond to the UK until it has samples of the nerve agent used. The Prime Minister has given the Kremlin until midnight to explain how the Russian nerve agent came to be used in the attack against Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. Well, we'll get the latest reaction from Moscow with our correspondent Lisa Holland in a moment. But first to Westminster, Laura Bundock is there. Laura, in the last hour, we've had the Russians saying that they are demanding a sample of this Novichok before that they will give any response. Has there been any counter-response from Prime Minister May's office?
Not as yet as to whether or not they'd hand over the samples, but certainly we've seen an escalation of the tension, I think, between Russia and the UK at the moment. Theresa May, very robust in the Commons yesterday when she said she thought it was highly likely that Moscow was behind the attack. That's when she set this midnight deadline. And as you'd understand, you can appreciate that a lot of attention is focused on that deadline now here in Westminster. There was a meeting of the Cabinet today where Theresa May told her colleagues she believed that this attack was indiscriminate, it was despicable, she said, and there was no doubting the seriousness of what had happened. She said that she will return to the House of Commons tomorrow for another statement if no credible response comes from Moscow. Now, at the same time, we've also had a meeting of COBRA this morning, the emergency committee. That was chaired by the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. Fairly operational, really. She was getting an update on the latest with the investigation. We're also told that the National Security Council will be meeting tomorrow again. They will be looking at the various options available to the UK should Moscow fail to come up with the response that the government would like them to. I think it's fair to say that they will be looking at the various options in terms of lesser sanctions right through to the more extreme end of things and assessing exactly how the Kremlin might retaliate should any of those options be selected. We know that Theresa May at some point today is due to talk to Donald Trump as well. That will be an interesting conversation. We We know that she has been very pleased, her spokesperson said, with the response and reaction she's had from other international partners so far. But the government behind the scenes will be making a lot of these kinds of calls, because I think it's crucial for them to galvanise the international support as much as possible from NATO allies, from European partners as well. But for all the tough talk from Theresa May yesterday in the Commons, I think she will be judged on how she responds tomorrow with her actions.
Laura, thanks very much for that. Well, let's cross to Lisa Holland, who is in Moscow for us. Lisa, perhaps no surprise that the Russians are meeting fire with fire, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. They've really torpedoed any notion of a kind of midnight deadline, or even any dreams that they might have gone to Theresa May meekly, trying to help and explain and resolve this diplomatic crisis. Quite simply and bluntly, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has come out and said, look, you're not even playing by the rule book, Mrs. May, when it comes to the use of prohibited chemicals, and that you should have given us 10 days to come back to you. And they're also saying that they want access to the nerve agent detected in Salisbury. And quite simply, that's not something that's going to happen in the next few hours or even overnight. This is what Sergei Lavrov had to say this morning.
As soon as the rumours first started being spread by practically every member of the British government that the substance Skripal was poisoned with came from the Russian Federation, we immediately made an official request to gain access to this substance so that our experts could carry out an analysis. We also asked for access to all the facts associated with the investigation, given that one of the victims is Yulia Skripal, a Russian citizen. But in response to this completely legal request, we have received an incomprehensible response, which broadly comes down to the fact that these legal requests have been refused.
Now, we know that yesterday the Russian ambassador to the UK was summoned and given a dressing down and told of Theresa May's demands. So therefore, in diplomatic terms, it's not a question of if but when. The reversal of that would happen here in Moscow. Julie, that happened today with Britain's ambassador Laurie Bristow summoned to the Foreign Ministry. Interesting choice of words, though, because on Russian television, the use of the word summoned was made. But when I spoke to the British Embassy here in Moscow this afternoon, they say, no, he wasn't summoned. It was a pre-planned meeting. Either way, whichever way you want to cut it up, Laurie Bristow went along to the Foreign Ministry. He was filmed as he went inside. Then he came out, said he wouldn't take any questions, but just reiterated Theresa May's demands.
I've just had a short meeting with Deputy Foreign Minister Titov to discuss the events in Salisbury and Prime Minister May's statement in the House of Commons yesterday. I reiterated the points made by Prime Minister May that we expect by the end of today an account from the Russian state as to how this material came to be used in Salisbury. The Prime Minister will take decisions and make an announcement in the course of tomorrow as to what our response will be. Thank you.
I'm pretty sure that won't be the only time that the British ambassador to Moscow is summoned over this crisis. I think we are most certainly now in this cycle of playing hardball between the two countries. And moreover, if firm action is taken by Theresa May within the next few days, we can expect a tit-for-tat scenario. Indeed, I've heard it said that various officials who currently reside in Moscow, working at the British Embassy, are unsure whether they will still be here this time next week.
Well, the European Union has offered its support to Britain over the case of the poisoned spy. In a statement, the EU also described the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia as shocking. European Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans called for an EU-wide response at the European Parliament in Strasbourg.
It is of the utmost importance that those who are responsible for what has happened see very clearly that there is European solidarity, unequivocal, unwavering and very strong, so that those responsible are really punished for what they did. We cannot have nerve gas being used in our societies. This should be addressed by all of us and not just left to Prime Minister May and the British government. It is a collective European responsibility, also under the OPCW rules.
Well, the European Union has offered its support to Britain over this case, as we were just saying. Let's talk to our Europe correspondent, Mark Stone, who's outside the headquarters of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague. And Mark, strong words from them too, that action needs to be taken.
Yes, you really get a sense of the gravity of this situation, the seriousness of what has happened. Very different, for example, from the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, his poisoning back in 2006, a radioactive substance used there. But you heard from Frans Timmermans that the idea that a nerve agent could be used on European soil, it is the first time that has happened since the Second World War, and the condemnation from all quarters of the European Union has been total and very, very hard in terms of the wording that different people have used. It is by chance that this organisation, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, based here in The Hague, was meeting for its annual meeting today. Each of the 192 member countries, pretty much every country in the world, has an ambassador who sits within this organisation. It's usually their ambassador to the Netherlands. The British ambassador was, of course, here as well today. And as an addendum to the schedule of what they were supposed to be discussing, he did make a short statement. I'll read some of it to you. He said, "I did not expect to have to brief this council on the first offensive use of a nerve agent of any sort on European territory since World War II. This attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British city was not just a crime against the Skripals, it was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the UK, which puts the lives of innocent civilians at risk. The stark conclusion is that it is highly likely that Russia, a fellow state party to this organisation, is implicated in chemicals weapons use, whether by failure to control its own materials or by design." So that there is a statement by Peter Wilson, the British representative to this organisation. And I can tell you that he received almost unanimous support from within that organisation to that statement. Of course, Russia is a signatory to this place. It has an ambassador who was here. We haven't managed to catch up with him. I'm not sure we will either. But what's interesting is that the other thing that they were talking about on the agenda here today was a landmark agreement which Russia made with this organisation back in September last year, where it came to where its attempt to destroy its chemical weapons stockpile was reached. And this organisation was pretty in agreement that Russia had indeed destroyed its chemical weapon stockpile. But what we also know is that Novostol, the agent which appears to have been used in Salisbury, had not been declared by the Russians. So what we don't know is whether the people inside here knew about its existence at all.
Mark, thanks very much for that. We've got a bit of breaking news that we can bring you. It could be linked to Salisbury, or could not be linked to Salisbury, we don't know. Police are investigating the unexplained death of a Russian man in his 60s in Kingston on Monday, the 12th of March. Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command are leading this because, it says, of associations of the man. Let's talk to Mark White, who's down in central London for us. Mark, the police saying that they don't at this stage necessarily think it's linked to the Salisbury investigation, but clearly, given the fact that this man is Russian and that clearly he has associations that they are concerned about, they are investigating this as well.
Yeah, I mean, what they're saying is that at this stage there's no evidence to link it to the events that have unfolded in Salisbury, but it could prove significant. Sources are telling us that the deceased man is Nikolai Glushkov, who was a close friend of the Russian exile tycoon Boris Berezovsky, who you remember was found dead in 2013 reported to have committed suicide. Many people have questioned that version of events because he was an outspoken critic of the Kremlin. Well, Nikolai Khrushchev was also an outspoken critic of the Kremlin. He was granted asylum in the UK in 2011. He'd been living in London in the Kingston area. Now he has been found dead, discovered by his family. Police not naming him at this stage, but we do have a statement from the police, and the involvement of Counter-Terror Command is significant. Let me just read it to you. It says an investigation is underway following the death of a man in his 60s in the borough of Kingston in London. Police were called by London Ambulance Service at 22:46. That's just after 11:15 on Monday night. The reports were of a man found deceased at a residential address in Clarence Avenue in New Malden. Officers attended and the next of kin have been informed, according to the police. They say, whilst we believe we know the identity of the deceased, formal identification has still to take place. A post-mortem examination will be held in due course. The death, they say, is currently being treated as unexplained. If there's a change in the status of the investigation, the police are saying that an update will come out. But this is what is clearly unusual, even though they say there is no link at this stage or evidence of any link to Salisbury. They say at this stage the Met Police Counter-Terrorism Command is leading the investigation as a precaution because of associations that man is believed to have had. And these associations are with that tycoon, that former Russian tycoon, Boris Berezovsky, found dead, and the fact, of course, that this man himself, a Russian dissident, was a very strong critic of the Kremlin and had said that he feared for his life, that he feared that he may himself be the subject of an assassination attempt. He spoke actually after the death of Boris Berezovsky when officials and a police investigation concluded that Mr. Berezovsky had committed suicide, to say he very much doubted that was the case. Mr. Berezovsky was found hanged at his home in Berkshire by his ex-wife at that time. There was a clearly a detailed investigation that was carried out by police at that time, and the conclusion was that there was nothing suspicious about this, that it was suicide. But many who have been very suspicious of the Russian state and potential Russian state involvement in the deaths of a number of Kremlin critics over the years believed that Boris Berezovsky was another of the Kremlin's victims, as they would describe him. And of course, this man, Nikolai Khrushchev, was one who very much bought into that theory that Boris Berezovsky met an untimely end not at his own hands. Well, the breaking news this hour is that Mr. Khrushchev has himself now been found dead at his home in New Malden in the Kingston borough of central London late last night. And the very unusual aspect of this case is, although it's an unexplained death, at this stage Counter-Terrorism Command detectives are leading that investigation, and they say, Jane, that they have no evidence to suggest a link to Salisbury, but it is very early on in this investigation.
It is early on, Mark, isn't it? But it's interesting reflecting on what the Home Secretary Amber Rudd said today about these 14 other cases of deaths of prominent Russians in the UK over the last few years, and whether or not they should be reinvestigated. Given that political sensitivity, given the fact that there is so much activity down here in Salisbury, if this were to be linked potentially, it's quite audacious, isn't it, that whilst this investigation into what is happening here goes on, potentially another Russian dissident could potentially, we are saying, have been murdered. Yeah, I mean, audacious doesn't even begin to describe it. It would be just
utterly incredible to think that there could be another death that has been linked to the Russian state just so soon after what has happened in Salisbury. But as you say, the caveats that we must attach to this at this stage are that there's absolutely no evidence to suggest anything untoward, other than it is being treated as an unexplained death, that it is being led by the Counter-Terror Command detectives. That is very unusual in itself, but Scotland Yard say that the reason they're doing that is because of the man's links, and the man was a Russian dissident. He was a vocal critic of the Kremlin, an individual who came out and voiced his scepticism at the official British authorities' conclusion that Boris Berezovsky's death was a suicide. Now, you mentioned that statement from Amber Rudd earlier today, Jane, after the Cobra meeting in central London, where she said that unexplained deaths, a number of unexplained deaths, would be investigated again by counter-terrorism officers. Well, Boris Berezovsky's death is one of those deaths, we understand, that will be looked at again. So this case is forever widening. At the moment, all we can say is that a very potentially significant development is occurring in the Kingston area of London, the borough of Kingston and New Malden, with the death of another Russian dissident late last night. It's being led by Counter-Terrorism Command. They're at the house. That area is cordoned off at the moment. You would understand that to be the case, and it will be cordoned off for some time as forensic teams carry out their investigation into what at this stage is an unexplained death. So there will be forensic teams fully kitted out in their white forensics clothes conducting that investigation. In the meantime, we don't know if there will be any further precautions. Of course, we know what is unfolding in Salisbury in terms of those who are investigating active crime scenes there, wearing those protective chemical, radiological and biological hazmat suits. It's possible, I guess, that those teams who go on to carry out a more detailed examination of the address in New Malden and London might also be further protected. We've no information on that at this stage. We have crews on their way to New Malden at the moment, so we'll be able to get hopefully some kind of a look ourselves. But it is the scene, an active crime scene at the moment, with those counter-terrorism detectives backed up by local borough officers, and of course those forensic teams now in sight, on site as well, carrying out their investigation. The family of Nikolai Glushkov, we're told, have been informed. They are being comforted by officers, family liaison officers, as is of course the case in tragic circumstances. So they're being looked after at this stage and being questioned, of course, as well about what they might know. There are reports circulating on the Russian side that we have not been able to confirm from some Russian media about the manner of his death. I won't go into that because we have nothing that substantiates that in any way. All we can say is, and this is officially being now confirmed by Scotland Yard, is that his death at this stage is being treated as unconfirmed. As unexplained.
Yeah. Mark, thanks very much for that. Well, it's going to be a busy few hours, isn't it, for Theresa May? She's given the Russians this deadline of midnight tonight. Let's cross to our political correspondent, Laura Bundock, who's in Westminster for us. Laura, what is going to happen now? The Russians have said that they aren't going to respond by midnight unless they get a sample of this Novichok, this chemical nerve agent. What will happen if they haven't responded by midnight? What will we see tomorrow from the Prime Minister?
Well, what we're going to see later on today is Theresa May is due to have a phone call with Donald Trump at some point. That hasn't happened yet. It will happen. That will be one of these critical calls. The government's been making lots of these sorts of phone calls, trying to galvanise as much international support as possible from its allies within NATO's European partners as well. So we've got that phone call to take place. If this midnight deadline passes and there has been no credible response from Russia, then it's up to the National Security Council. They will be looking at what the next step should be. And I think it's fair to say they will be examining all the possible options in terms of to what degree those sanctions might take. And I think they will certainly be assessing how Russia might retaliate given whichever option Theresa May chooses to take. Now, we know should there be no response from Russia by midnight, we will expect her to return to the Commons at some point tomorrow to make another statement. And we would expect a bit more detail on the response in that statement as well. Slightly hypothetical at the moment, because at the moment the government is simply saying, let's wait till midnight, let's wait for that deadline. But as we know, Russia has said there will be no response from us, frankly. So these phone calls are going to be important. As there's many countries as possible that the UK can get on side, then that will bolster their position as well. But I think let's wait till midnight and we'll see if Theresa May's tough talk yesterday in the Commons will be matched by tough action as well.
Let's get more now on our top story and the poisoning of a former Russian spy and his daughter in Salisbury. Theresa May has said Russian involvement in the attack is highly likely, and the government is now considering a range of measures against the country if it doesn't give a credible response by midnight. They could include accelerating the government's cyber offensive programme. Well, I'm joined now by Brian Lord, former Deputy Director for Intelligence and Cyber Operations at GCHQ. Brian Lord, thanks for joining us this afternoon. So there's a lot of talk about a cyber offensive now being carried out on the Russians. What form could that take?
Well, there is a lot of speculation, and I think what's very clear to say is at the moment is when one uses the phrase like sort of cyber attack and cyber warfare, one creates an image of things that aren't necessarily the case, of sort of national grids being taken. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about are a lot more subtle types of activity which are aimed at very focused and very specifically disrupting any kind of adversary's dependence on a digital system. So I don't think we should over-dramatise what this may look like. It will also be applied as part of a sort of complementary supporting element to other actions that are taken rather than an isolated activity in itself.
There is a danger of this becoming tit for tat, though, and it was only a couple of months ago that we heard the Defence Secretary talking about the Russians sizing up the UK's energy infrastructure.
Indeed, and I think what's also worth bearing in mind, of course, what the UK doesn't want to do is enter into some kind of cyber conflict. This isn't about escalation. It's about being able to demonstrate to Russia that they are, if indeed they are responsible, should behave in a responsible way. But what's also worth bearing in mind is that actually, regardless of whether or not the UK does or doesn't apply capability through the cyber domain, it is quite likely that any response to any activity from Russia will have some kind of disruptive cyber element. They've demonstrated that in the past.
Can the UK defend itself from all forms of cyber attacks on the country?
When one is dealing with a fairly competent and capable adversary such as Russia, I think, as with all elements, there are some elements that are very strongly protected and very, very well protected. The National Cybersecurity Centre works with industry to help sure that they are protected. But there are always soft underbellies that a state like Russia could go after if it was simply wanting to be seen to be doing something. So I think there are, as with all elements, some areas are better protected than others.
OK, Brian Lord, thanks for your time.
Good afternoon. You are watching Sky News live at 5 from Salisbury on a day of diplomatic twists and turns as police investigate the poisoning of a former spy and his daughter. The Kremlin has until midnight to give a credible response as to how a Russian nerve agent was used in the attempted murders of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. As that investigation continues, another one has started in southwest London following the death of Nikolai Glushkov, a Putin critic and close associate of the late oligarch Boris Berezovsky. Well, for more, our Home Affairs correspondent Mark White joins us from central London. Mark, two dissident Russians killed within the space of just over a week. Counter-terrorism police investigating both, but the police not saying that they are necessarily linked.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very intriguing development. We can put it no stronger than that at this point. It's unusual that Counter-Terrorism Command would be called in to carry out the lead investigation task here. They say they are doing that because of the associations that this man had had, and the associations are effectively that he was an arch critic of the Kremlin, that he was close friends with the tycoon Boris Berezovsky, who was himself found dead back in March 2013. And at that time, Nikolai Glushkov told anyone who would listen that he didn't believe that Boris Berezovsky had committed suicide, as the official reporting from the authorities suggested. He believed that Boris Berezovsky had been killed on the orders of the Kremlin. Well, this man himself, now Nikolai Glushkov, was found dead. It was 11:15 last night in New Malden, the Kingston borough of London, when police and emergency services were called to an address in Clarence Avenue in New Malden to reports that a man had been found dead. They found Nikolai Glushkov dead inside these premises. They say at this stage that his death is being treated as unexplained, and counter-terrorism detectives are taking the lead on this investigation, as I said. Now, as far as the scene is concerned, we have seen pictures from the scene already that show, as you would imagine, quite a bit of police activity around there. There's a forensic tent. Forensics officers are on site along with those counter-terrorism detectives, and we've just got to see how this investigation goes. But to give you an indication of just how much of a critic of the Kremlin this man was, and someone that the Kremlin were very anxious to get returned to Russia, actually to stand trial on criminal charges. I can point you to a page that is from the Russian embassy in the UK. It's an article that was penned in March 2017, and it's effectively a list of around 24 or so people that the Kremlin claim are criminals, that are people that are being given refuge, asylum in the UK, and that they are frustrated that they're not able to get a hold of these individuals. Right at the very top of that list is Nikolai Glushkov. So that gives you an indication of the way in which the Russian state certainly viewed this individual. They say they viewed him as a criminal who was granted asylum in the UK, that they had formally bid for his extradition back to Russia, but were very frustrated that that process was being blocked by the authorities in the UK. So, as I say, the very top of that list on that page by the UK embassy in Russia.
Mark, thanks very much for that. Well, despite these warnings, Public Health England says the risk to the public in Salisbury is low. For more on that, let's cross to central London and speak to Sky's health correspondent Paul Kelso. Paul, no change in the official advice?
No, there hasn't been, and Public Health England's advice and assessment of this has been consistent since the Sunday evening when news of this poisoning first emerged, and they first became aware of what they were dealing with, which was at the same time as the police within 24 hours. They have said from the outset that there is a low risk to the public. They have received some criticism, particularly from those living in Salisbury who have seen people in chemical suits inspecting restaurants and pubs and treating this as clearly as a very, very dangerous subject, while the people have been told they don't need to have anything to worry about. Last Sunday, the advice to anyone who'd been to the pub and the restaurant where the couple were on the afternoon that they were poisoned was to wash their clothes, to wash any belongings, phones, spectacles, watches, and that advice, Public Health England so was based on the fact they received new information, which that there were very small trace elements, almost undetectable, they were described to me as, and that in response to that, the advice was to wash it away, and diluting this substance with water does work to wash it away. And the Public Health England have defended their decision to not make that advice at the very beginning, at the very outset of this, and said throughout they've followed the evidence. I put all this to their medical director a couple of hours ago. This is what he had to say.
Of course, we're concerned about any exposure to this substance, but it is clear that any significant exposure that anybody has will lead to them becoming ill, and we would expect to see them in our services. And as you may have heard this afternoon, people have been assessed, and the vast majority of those discharged from hospital without needing any kind of treatment. The question of trace exposures is one, again, that we've been addressing throughout by saying that the risk is exceptionally low.
Paul Cosford went on to say that, in his view and the view of the experts they've been working with, there is no good science that bears out the claim from the Russian former chemical scientist that there could be a long-term impact from even trace elements. So what they've focused on is the significant exposures. Bluntly, if there'd been more of those, there would be many, many more extremely ill people in hospital in Salisbury.
Paul Calso from London, thanks very much there. Well, let's cross from Paul to Lisa Holland, who is in Moscow, and of course that has been the centre of a lot of attention over the last few hours. Meetings between the British ambassador there and the deputy foreign minister. Lisa, what reaction has there been from Moscow today for what has been happening in the UK?
Well, Jane, frankly, I think that the Russians are meeting fire with fire. If yesterday there was a wide sense that Theresa May was being fairly robust in her outlining of her statement in the Commons, the Russians certainly are not going to be any kind of rollover in their response to it. And in fact, whilst London keeps talking about a clock ticking towards midnight and a deadline imposed by Theresa May that the Russians should answer the questions that she has laid out, the Russians have point blank refused to do that. They say that they are not guilty here, that they are not on trial, and if they're going to be put on trial, frankly, then they should be allowed to have a look at some of the evidence. In other words, they want to be allowed to make an assessment of the nerve agent discovered in Salisbury. This is what the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has had to say.
As soon as the rumours first started being spread by practically every member of the British government that the substance Skripal was poisoned with came from the Russian Federation, we immediately made an official request to gain access to this substance so that our experts could carry out an analysis. We also asked for access to all the facts associated with the investigation, given that one of the victims is Yulia Skripal, a Russian citizen. But in response to this completely legal request, we have received an incomprehensible response, which broadly comes down to the fact that these legal requests have been refused.
Now, yesterday, the Russian ambassador to London was summoned to be told of Theresa May's demands and questions. And as sure as day follows night, you would expect that the same would happen in Moscow. And of course, it did today, with the British ambassador being summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now, interestingly, I spoke to the British embassy today, and they didn't really want to use the word summoned. They say it was a pre-planned meeting. Either way, there was a diplomatic meeting of the big guns in town today, with the British ambassador going to the Foreign Ministry, and this is what the British ambassador had to say on his way out.
I've just had a short meeting with Deputy Foreign Minister Titov to discuss the events in Salisbury and Prime Minister May's statement in the House of Commons yesterday. I reiterated the points made by Prime Minister May that we expect by the end of today an account from the Russian state as to how this material came to be used in Salisbury. The Prime Minister will take decisions and make an announcement in the course of tomorrow as to what our response will be. Thank you.
So I think it's quite clear from what Moscow has said today that this deadline imposed by Theresa May simply won't be met, which quite firmly puts the ball back in London's court. The Russians have said, though, that if any action is taken against them, and they mentioned potential sanctions, and we know that, of course, the big worry as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned is that hitting him hardest would be hitting him in his back pocket, in essence, looking at sanctions which affect the financial situation here. They say any sanctions will be met with a robust response from Moscow.
Lisa, thanks very much for that. Well, here the Home Secretary has suggested that in the wake of the Skripal case, investigations could be reopened into the deaths of other prominent Russians in the UK. It follows an investigation by BuzzFeed, which identified other suspicious deaths. Well, we're going to speak to Heidi Blake, the journalist who led that investigation, shortly. But let's quickly return to Sky News Centre first, where Gamal has details at the screen.
An investigative report by BuzzFeed news sites last year uncovered 14 deaths that US spy agencies have linked to Russia. Let's take a look at just some of these cases now. Well, perhaps the most high-profile was in November 2006 when Alexander Litvinenko was killed by radioactive polonium, believed to have been put in a cup of tea. The UK public inquiry into his death concluded that there was a strong possibility his murder was ordered by Vladimir Putin. Now, in 2008, exiled Georgian billionaire Badri Pahatashvili was found dead in his mansion in Surrey. Russian whistleblower Alexander Perlichny collapsed near his home in Surrey in 2012. Now, a court heard that he could have been poisoned, but key evidence about his last meal was flushed away hours after his death. Boris Berezovsky, who was a close ally of Pahatashvili, the two oligarchs had built up a vast business empire in Russia in the post-communist era. He was found hanged at his home in Ascot in 2013. And there was Scott Young, the 52-year-old property tycoon, died when he fell from a fifth-floor window in Marylebone onto railings in December 2014. Home Secretary Amber Rudd says some of these will now be looked at again.
My priority is this incident, the investigation itself, so we get all the information as quickly as possible, and also the safety and security of the people in the community, which is why we have such close coordination with the Department of Health and with Public Health England. In terms of the other question, in terms of other investigations, there will come a time when I will need to satisfy myself in terms of getting assurances from the police and other investigators about them. But at this moment, my priority is on the investigation itself.
Well, let's discuss this a bit further now. Let's talk to Heidi Blake, investigations editor at BuzzFeed, who's in central London for us. And Heidi, we spoke last week. We talked about these 14 names of people that the police haven't investigated, that you felt should be investigated. Do you feel that, looking at the events in New Malden this evening with Nikolai Grushkov, that should be included in that list?
Well, it's good to see that counter-terror police are leading the investigation into the death of Nikolai Grushkov. Clearly, at this point, there's no evidence to suggest that that is connected to any of the other deaths that we've identified, links to Russia on British soil, or to the poisoning of Sergei Skripal. But clearly, this is an individual who has previously angered the Kremlin, who's sought political asylum in the UK because he didn't feel safe in Russia. So it's good to see that death being treated seriously, for sure.
Remind us, why do you believe these other deaths weren't properly investigated?
Well, we identified 14 suspicious deaths linked to Russia where we could see overwhelming evidence showing that these individuals had previously received threats from Russia, had warned the police, their families, their friends, that their lives were in danger. They felt that they were being targeted. Many of them had been the targets of previous assassination attempts that Scotland Yard had foiled. And yet, when they were found dead in what were patently suspicious circumstances in many cases, in every single one of those 14 cases, the British police said that there was nothing suspicious and shut down any investigation very quickly. So it's great to see now that Amber Rudd is saying that she's going to review all of those cases and ask for help from the police. But we have some questions about how exactly the police will be able to help, given that in many of those cases there's no crime scene evidence, critical, autopsy evidence either wasn't gathered or will have been lost, and witnesses will have been will be long gone by now. So I think in many cases opportunities to investigate will have been lost, but it's great that the police are going to look at those cases again.
I mean, and from your investigation into these cases, you say now time has passed. It will be nigh on impossible to investigate these cases. Do you think that there is any viability in reopening these investigations?
Well, what we do know is that in all 14 cases, there is classified intelligence linking those deaths to Russia, which the US intelligence community has passed to MI6. I think there are many calls now across the political spectrum for a full public inquiry into those deaths. That would be the only way that an independent judge or, somebody who convened that inquiry would be able to review the intelligence material connecting those deaths to Russia alongside any criminal evidence that the police might have gathered. But I think a narrow police inquiry into those deaths at this point is unlikely to discover very much, given that, as I say, much of that evidence will be lost.
OK, Heidi Blake, investigations editor at BuzzFeed. Thanks very much for joining us.